A millionaire deliberately humiliated his black wife by bringing his mistress to a business meeting. His plan backfired when the mistress recognized his wife as the powerful CEO she'd been trying to secure a contract with. His attempt to shame his wife exposed his own secret infidelity to his most important business partner. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The mahogany boardroom hummed with the low thrum of air conditioning and the hushed whispers of anticipation. Ava, CEO of Stellar Tech, sat poised at the head of the long table, her tailored pantsuit a stark contrast to the nervous fidgeting of the potential investors. Sunlight glinted off her perfectly sculpted nails as she tapped them lightly against the polished surface. Internally, however, a familiar icy dread coiled in her stomach. This wasn't just another business meeting. It was Julian's meticulously crafted stage for public humiliation. Julian, her husband, sat beside her, a smug smile playing on his lips. He'd spent weeks subtly undermining her confidence, whispering doubts about her competence, planting seeds of insecurity. He loved the power he held over her, the ability to make her doubt herself, even in a room filled with people who revered her. The scent of his expensive cologne, usually comforting, felt suffocating today, a potent reminder of their fractured marriage. His carefully chosen words, laced with veiled insults, hung in the air. Ava's quite driven. Sometimes a little too driven, he'd said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The investors, mostly men, chuckled nervously, not entirely understanding the subtle dig at her ambition. Ava, however, felt the sting. She met his gaze, her expression unchanged, a mask of professional composure concealing the simmering anger within. This was a battle of wills, and she wouldn't let him win. Not this time. The air crackled with unspoken tensions, thick and heavy like the humidity clinging to the Chicago air outside. The meeting was about to begin its descent into chaos. The door opened, and Simone entered, a vision in a silk dress the color of a summer sunset. Julian's triumphant smirk was almost comical, a grotesque caricature of self-satisfaction. He'd positioned her perfectly, a deliberate visual juxtaposition against Ava's tailored power suit. The scent of Simone's perfume, a sharp, citrusy blend, clashed with the subtle woody notes of Ava's own fragrance, mirroring the disharmony in the room. Simone, initially oblivious, smiled brightly, her eyes scanning the room. She paused, her gaze landing on Ava. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, quickly replaced by a nervous smile. Ava's expression remained unchanged, but a tremor ran through her, a subtle vibration beneath the carefully constructed facade. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was a blatant disregard for her dignity, a public display of Julian's contempt, performed for an audience of powerful men. "Darling, this is Simone," Julian announced, his voice oozing false charm. "Simone, this is my wife, Ava." He emphasized the word wife, a barbed arrow aimed straight at Ava's heart. The subtle inflection, the barely concealed sneer, was a testament to his cruelty, his deliberate intention to inflict pain. Simone, now acutely aware of something amiss, stammered, "It's a pleasure. I've heard wonderful things." Her voice lacked conviction, her eyes darting nervously between Ava and Julian. The air thickened with unspoken tension, a palpable energy that crackled in the silent spaces between their words. Ava's fingers tightened around her water glass, the ice clinking softly, a counterpoint to the drumming of her heart. She met Simone's gaze, her own eyes unwavering, a silent challenge veiled in polite professionalism. "The pleasure is all mine," she replied, her voice cool and measured, a carefully crafted shield against the torrent of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The subtle tremor in her voice betrayed her inner turmoil, however, a hint of the quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. The meeting continued, a strange dance of polite conversation and veiled hostility. The investors, sensing the undercurrent of tension, exchanged nervous glances, their initial enthusiasm waning. The carefully constructed facade of Julian's success began to crumble, revealing the cracks of insecurity and resentment that lay beneath. The subtle shift in power dynamics was palpable. The planned humiliation was veering dangerously off course. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Ava's fingertips. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars hung heavy in the air, a suffocating perfume of Julian's carefully cultivated success. She watched, outwardly calm, as Julian leaned closer to Simone, his voice a low murmur that carried just enough to be overheard. The casual intimacy was a deliberate act of cruelty, a blatant disregard for her presence. Ava felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the icy grip of a long-held hurt. Years of subtle slights, of microaggressions that chipped away at her confidence, all culminated in this moment. She tasted bile at the back of her throat. Simone, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the simmering tension. Her laughter, bright and unburdened, grated on Ava's nerves. There was a naivete about her, a self-assuredness born of ambition, that felt both infuriating and pitiable. Ava saw the way Julian's eyes lingered on Simone, the possessive gleam a stark contrast to the empty gaze he usually reserved for her. A tremor ran through Ava. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the casual disregard for everything she'd built, for her accomplishments. The subtle shift in the investor's demeanor confirmed her fears. Their initial enthusiasm was dwindling, replaced by a hesitant unease. Julian's carefully crafted facade of success was beginning to crack, exposing the fragile foundation of resentment and insecurity. "Darling," Julian said, his voice dripping with false affection. "Simone's insights into the marketing sector are invaluable. Her firm has considerable clout." His eyes, however, were not on Simone. They were fixed on Ava, a challenge in their depths. The subtle caress of his hand on Simone's back was deliberate, a pointed display of ownership and disdain aimed squarely at his wife. Ava met Julian's gaze, her own expression unchanged. Inside, however, a storm raged. The controlled politeness of her response was a testament to her professionalism, a shield against the wave of raw emotion threatening to break through. "Indeed," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Perhaps Simone can share her expertise later. We have a timeline to adhere to." Her words were a carefully constructed barrier, but the icy tone betrayed the carefully concealed fury within. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. The planned humiliation had taken an unexpected turn. A new player had entered the game, and the stakes were far higher than Julian had ever anticipated. The air in the conference room, thick with the scent of expensive coffee and simmering tension, crackled with unspoken accusations. Ava's perfectly tailored suit felt like a cage, constricting her as she watched Julian's practiced charm unravel before her eyes. He was a master of performance, a chameleon shifting colors to suit his audience, but his carefully constructed facade was beginning to fray. The investors, initially impressed by Julian's flamboyant presentation, now shifted uneasily in their seats, their attention drifting between Julian's increasingly erratic pronouncements and Ava's unwavering composure. Julian, oblivious to the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, continued his performance. He gestured expansively, his hand brushing against Simone's arm with a familiarity that felt both deliberate and sickening. Simone, initially flattered by Julian's attention, now registered a flicker of unease. The investor's subtle withdrawal, the tightening of Ava's jaw, something felt off. The easy confidence that had characterized her arrival had been replaced by a glacial stillness. Her silence, however, was more potent than any outburst. "As I was saying," Julian continued, his voice slightly higher pitched than usual, "Simone's innovative marketing strategies are exactly what this project needs. Her insights are unparalleled." His gaze, sharp and predatory, darted towards Ava. It was a blatant attempt to assert dominance, to remind everyone, especially Ava, of his control. Ava's eyes, dark and fathomless, met his. There was no tremor in her voice, no visible reaction to his transparent provocation. Yet the quiet intensity in her gaze spoke volumes. It was a silent challenge, a declaration of war waged with icy precision. The subtle way she adjusted her posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips, all conveyed a simmering fury held tightly in check. She was a volcano poised on the brink of eruption, her power held in reserve. "Of course," Ava replied, her voice calm but firm. "However, we have a strict timeline to meet, and any deviation from our established plan risks jeopardizing the launch date." Her words were impeccably professional, yet the subtle steel in her tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, thinly veiled but unmistakably clear. Julian's carefully constructed game was slipping from his grasp, and the realization dawned on him with a chilling clarity. The subtle shift in the room's energy wasn't merely due to the investor's concerns. It was the silent, steely presence of his wife, a woman far more powerful than he'd ever allowed himself to acknowledge. The meticulously planned humiliation was turning into a dangerous game of chance, one he was losing. The mahogany table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room, reflecting the nervous energy radiating from the assembled investors. Julian, a picture of arrogant composure, adjusted his cufflinks, the small, repetitive action betraying his inner turmoil. He stole a glance at Ava, her stillness a stark contrast to his own fidgeting. He'd meticulously planned this. The subtle slight, the public humiliation, designed to chip away at her carefully constructed confidence. He'd chosen this specific meeting, a crucial presentation for a lucrative contract, to showcase Simone, his mistress, and simultaneously undermine Ava's position. A nervous tremor ran through him, a stark contrast to his outward show of confidence. He wasn't simply seeking to humiliate Ava. He was battling a deep-seated fear, a fear of her surpassing him, of her brilliance eclipsing his own carefully crafted image. The scent of Ava's perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, filled the air, a constant, silent reminder of the woman he was attempting to diminish. Simone arrived, a vision in a scarlet dress, her confidence radiating like the sun. Her smile, bright and oblivious, was a weapon in Julian's carefully orchestrated plan. He introduced her with a flourish, his voice dripping with a practiced charm that felt thin and brittle to Ava. The investors murmured their polite greetings, their eyes drawn to Simone's vibrant presence. Ava watched, her expression carefully neutral, a storm brewing beneath the calm exterior. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension, the low hum of the air conditioning a stark counterpoint to the beating of Julian's heart. He could almost feel the silent judgment emanating from Ava, a gaze that saw through his carefully constructed facade. The meticulously crafted humiliation was already beginning to unravel, the threads of his plan fraying under the weight of her quiet power. The air crackled with anticipation, the unspoken question hanging heavy. How would Ava react? Ava's silence was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket draped over the room. The scent of her perfume, a stark contrast to Simone's overpowering vanilla, seemed to sharpen the edges of the tension. Julian, momentarily thrown by Ava's composure, felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't the expected cowering, the tearful breakdown he'd anticipated. This quiet intensity was far more unsettling. Simone, finally noticing the strained atmosphere, her smile faltering, addressed Ava directly. "I'm Simone Dubois," she offered, extending a hand. Her voice, previously bright and confident, held a tentative note. The scarlet dress, previously a weapon, now felt like a gaudy spotlight on her own impending discomfort. Ava, her eyes locked on Julian, met Simone's hand with a glacial coolness. A slight pressure, a barely perceptible tremor in her fingers, was the only hint of the tempest raging within. "I know," Ava replied, her voice low and even, each word precise and deliberate, a carefully chosen weapon. The simple statement hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. The investors, sensing the shift in dynamics, exchanged uneasy glances. The murmur of polite conversation died, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the rhythmic tick of a clock on the wall. Julian felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The carefully constructed facade of his plan was crumbling. He watched, helpless, as his carefully planned humiliation began to unravel, not at Ava's hand, but at Simone's unwitting intervention. The air, once thick with anticipation, now crackled with a different kind of energy, the raw, unsettling energy of a secret about to be revealed. Julian's smug self-satisfaction evaporated, replaced by a cold, clammy fear. The game he'd so meticulously planned had taken an unexpected and terrifying turn. The mahogany table, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a cold, unforgiving judge, reflecting his escalating panic. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the scent of expensive coffee mingled with the faint, metallic tang of fear. Julian, his carefully constructed composure cracking, shifted uncomfortably in his designer chair. The mahogany gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting his own growing unease. He'd envisioned a different scene, Ava's tears a testament to his triumph. Instead, a chilling quiet held court, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock, each tick a hammer blow against his fragile ego. Ava's gaze remained fixed on Julian, her expression an unnerving mask of calm. The subtle tremor in her fingers, barely perceptible to Simone, spoke volumes to Julian. It was the tremor of controlled fury, the quiet prelude to a storm. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, a pain he'd inflicted countless times with his casual cruelties, his subtle slights. Now, that pain was laced with something colder, something that chilled him to the bone, disdain. Simone, her initial confidence shattered, fumbled with her perfectly manicured nails. The scarlet dress, once a symbol of her ambition, now felt heavy, suffocating. Her initial naivete was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a dawning horror. The vibrant confidence that had characterized her arrival had been replaced by a hesitant uncertainty, the beginning of a moral reckoning. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper against the oppressive silence. Her eyes, wide and frightened, darted between Ava and Julian. The weight of her unwitting betrayal pressed down on her, a crushing burden. The carefully crafted illusion of her own self-assuredness crumbled, leaving behind raw vulnerability. Ava's gaze, still unwavering, finally shifted to Simone. The coldness intensified, a glacial landscape devoid of warmth or compassion. There was no accusation, no outburst, only the silent weight of her judgment. It was a look that could freeze hellfire, and Julian felt a shiver of dread. He'd underestimated her, underestimated the strength hidden beneath her composed exterior. The investors, sensing the change in the air, shifted restlessly in their seats. The murmur of polite conversation was entirely gone, replaced by the pregnant silence of a brewing storm. The opulent boardroom, once a symbol of power and success, had become a battleground, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the raw, unsettling energy of impending revelation. Julian knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that the game was far from over. It had just begun. The silence stretched, a taut elastic band threatening to snap. The scent of expensive leather and polished mahogany couldn't mask the underlying tension, a palpable thing that hummed in the air like a faulty wire. Julian, his meticulously crafted composure crumbling faster than a cheap sandcastle, dabbed at his brow with a silk handkerchief, the damp fabric doing little to quell the sweat slicking his skin. He'd expected tears, a public display of Ava's supposed weakness. Instead, he faced a glacial stillness, Ava's eyes like chips of obsidian, reflecting nothing but cold, controlled fury. Simone, pale beneath her scarlet dress, shifted nervously. The expensive fabric felt like a shroud, clinging to her as though mirroring the suffocating weight of her guilt. Her carefully constructed facade of confidence had shattered, revealing the insecure woman beneath. The boardroom, previously a stage for her ambitious performance, now felt like a suffocating prison. I didn't understand," she stammered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the antique clock, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of Julian's deception. The words hung in the air, thin and fragile, revealing the cracks in her carefully constructed composure. Ava's gaze, icy and unwavering, finally shifted to Simone. Her lips, usually curved in a warm smile, were pressed into a thin line. "Understand what, exactly?" Her voice was low, controlled, each syllable a carefully measured drop of venom. The subtle tremor in her fingers, barely visible, betrayed the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. Years of subtle humiliations, of being overlooked, of having her intelligence dismissed, all fueled the simmering fury. Julian watched, his carefully constructed world teetering on the brink of collapse. The smug satisfaction he'd felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. He'd underestimated Ava's resilience, her capacity for controlled fury. He'd believed his carefully orchestrated humiliation would break her. Instead, it had exposed him. The investors, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, shifted uneasily. The air, thick with unspoken accusations, crackled with anticipation. The opulent boardroom, once a symbol of power, was now a pressure cooker, about to explode. The game, Julian realized with a chilling certainty, had only just begun. His carefully constructed empire was about to crumble, brick by painstaking brick. The clock ticked on, each second a countdown to his inevitable downfall. Ava's gaze, glacial and unwavering, held Simone captive. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the antique clock on the mahogany wall. The scent of expensive coffee, usually a comforting aroma, now felt cloying, heavy in the air like a suffocating blanket. Simone, her scarlet dress suddenly seeming garish and inappropriate, fidgeted, the expensive fabric rustling like dry leaves. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't quite mask the tremor in her hands, the pallor spreading across her cheeks. "Understand what, exactly?" Ava repeated, her voice a low, controlled hum that vibrated with barely contained power. The tremor in her voice was minimal, a barely perceptible quiver that hinted at the storm raging beneath the surface. It was the controlled fury of a woman who had endured years of subtle slights, of having her intelligence and achievements dismissed simply because of her skin color. Simone swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. The opulent boardroom, which moments before had felt like a stage for her carefully crafted ambition, now felt like a judge's chambers, her every move scrutinized. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, her carefully constructed words crumbling before they could take form. The weight of her actions, the realization of who she had so casually dismissed, pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Julian, meanwhile, watched in horrified fascination. His meticulously planned humiliation had backfired spectacularly. The smug satisfaction he'd felt moments before had vanished, replaced by a cold dread that seeped into his bones. He'd underestimated his wife's strength, her capacity for controlled rage. He had believed his carefully orchestrated humiliation would break her, but it had exposed him. The sweat on his brow grew colder, the silk handkerchief clutched in his hand damp and clammy. The board members, sensing the shift in power, exchanged nervous glances, the hum of hushed whispers replacing the earlier confident chatter. I didn't know," Simone finally managed, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. The words, weak and unconvincing, hung in the air, revealing the chasm between her ambition and the reality of her actions. The carefully crafted mask of confidence had finally cracked, revealing the insecure, vulnerable woman beneath. The weight of her deception pressed down on her. The game, Julian realized with sickening clarity, was far from over. His carefully constructed world, his empire of wealth and power, was about to crumble. The clock ticked on, each second a relentless reminder of his impending downfall. The air, thick with unspoken accusations and the scent of betrayal, crackled with anticipation. The meeting, intended as a tool of humiliation, was morphing into something far more dangerous. The mahogany table, polished to a high sheen, reflected the stark lines of Ava's face. Her expression, though carefully controlled, betrayed a flicker of something raw hurt, yes, but laced with a chilling quiet strength. The scent of expensive leather and old wood clung to the air, a stark contrast to the nervous sweat beating on Julian's forehead. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the expensive silk of his shirt rustling against his skin. Simone, her carefully constructed composure crumbling, stammered, I truly didn't know. If I had. Ava cut her off, her voice low and even, a silken blade slicing through the tense silence. Knowing wouldn't have changed a thing, would it, Ms. Dubois? Months of scheming, while my husband used me as a pawn in his pathetic little game. Julian, watching from the shadows of his own self-inflicted misery, felt the familiar knot of panic tighten in his chest. He'd expected a volcanic eruption, not this glacial calm. Ava's controlled fury was far more terrifying than any screaming match. He watched, helpless, as the woman he'd so carelessly attempted to humiliate systematically dismantled his carefully constructed lies. Simone's eyes welled with tears. I'm so sorry, Ms. Dubois, she choked out, her voice thick with remorse. I would never have. I didn't know. I swear. Ava didn't speak, simply rose from her chair. The movement was fluid, graceful, yet it carried the weight of years of suppressed frustration, of microaggressions endured and silently absorbed. She walked to the window. The city sprawled beneath them, a breathtaking panorama that held no comfort for her. The city lights, once symbols of success and power, now seemed to mirror the cold, hard reality of Julian's betrayal. The silence stretched, taut and unforgiving. Julian shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. He knew with sickening certainty that this wasn't just about Ava anymore. This was about the crumbling foundation of his empire, the carefully crafted image about to shatter into a million pieces. The knock at the door, a sharp, peremptory rap, was the final, agonizing tremor before the earth shifted beneath his feet. The knock echoed in the suffocating silence, a sharp crack against the backdrop of Julian's carefully constructed world. It was Marcus, his business partner, his friend, or so he'd believed. Julian felt a cold sweat slick his palms. The mahogany table, usually a symbol of his power, now felt like a judge's gavel, poised to deliver a crushing verdict. Ava, her back to him, remained motionless, a statue sculpted from ice and controlled fury. The city lights blurred through the window, mirroring the chaotic landscape of his own mind. He watched, paralyzed, as Ava turned, her face a mask of controlled anger. The way she moved, the way she met Marcus's gaze, spoke volumes. There was no plea for help in her eyes, only a chilling resolve. Marcus, his face etched with a mixture of shock and betrayal, looked from Ava to Simone, then to Julian. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, the silence a palpable entity. Julian. Marcus's voice was low, heavy with disappointment. Simone. She told me everything. Julian's throat constricted. The meticulously crafted facade, built on lies and deceit, began to crumble. He opened his mouth, searching for an explanation, a defense, but found only a dry, rasping sound. The expensive Persian rug beneath his feet felt suddenly cheap and flimsy, mirroring the fragile foundation of his empire. Simone, her face pale and drawn, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, offered a weak, almost inaudible, "I'm sorry, Marcus." Her apology felt as hollow as the promises Julian had whispered in her ear. Ava watched them, her expression unreadable. The weight of years of silent endurance, of subtle indignities endured and unspoken wounds, hung heavy in the air. The city below, a shimmering tapestry of lights, seemed to mock his arrogance, his delusion of invincibility. The game was over. His carefully orchestrated humiliation had backfired spectacularly, exposing not just his infidelity, but the shallowness of his character, the fragility of his empire. The silence stretched, a chasm of guilt and fear yawning between him and the two women he had wronged. The knock had not been just a sound. It was the death knell of his carefully constructed world. The opulent penthouse suite felt suddenly claustrophobic. The scent of expensive cigars, usually a comfort to Julian, now clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. He watched Marcus, his face a mask of stunned betrayal, his eyes mirroring the hurt that Julian had so carefully ignored. Simone, small and fragile, looked like a bird caught in a storm, her shoulders trembling slightly. Ava, however, remained a granite statue. I can explain," Julian stammered, his voice a pathetic whisper against the backdrop of the city's muted roar. His carefully constructed world, a fortress built on ambition and deceit, was crumbling before his eyes. Ava finally spoke, her voice low and controlled, a stark contrast to the tempest brewing within her. "There's nothing to explain, Julian. You thought you could humiliate me, break me. You failed." The ice in her eyes melted, revealing the simmering rage beneath. Years of microaggressions, of subtle insults and blatant dismissals, were finally unleashed. Simone, breaking free from her paralysis, rushed to speak. "Ava, please let me explain. I didn't know. I had no idea you were." She faltered, the weight of her deception heavy upon her. The ambition that had driven her now felt like a poisoned chalice. Marcus cut her off, his voice laced with a quiet fury. "There's nothing to explain, Simone. You knew what you were doing. You used me." His gaze shifted to Julian, his expression filled with a deep disappointment. "And you, Julian? I trusted you. I considered you a friend. You betrayed that trust in the most appalling way." The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air, thicker than the expensive perfume that clung to Simone's clothes. Ava's controlled fury began to crack, revealing the raw hurt beneath. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her chin lifted in defiance. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Julian watched, helpless, as his carefully constructed empire began to crumble. The city lights, previously symbols of his success, now felt like mocking eyes, judging him for his vanity, his cruelty. His attempt to shame his wife had exposed his own flaws, his own hypocrisy. The game, as he'd so cruelly played it, was now over. His carefully orchestrated humiliation had backfired spectacularly, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The silence stretched, a chasm of guilt and fear yawning between him and the three people he had so deeply wronged. The night, once promising triumph, now held only the bitter taste of defeat. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. Simone, her carefully constructed composure shattered, wrung her hands, the expensive silk of her dress rustling like dry leaves. The penthouse, a monument to Julian's wealth, felt suddenly cold, the panoramic city view offering no solace. Ava, her back ramrod straight, met Simone's gaze, her eyes reflecting the city lights, a glittering, unforgiving mirror to Simone's shame. I didn't know," Simone whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's hum. The scent of her expensive perfume, usually a symbol of her ambition, now smelled acrid, a reminder of her betrayal. "I truly didn't know she was you." Ava's silence was a heavy blanket. The years of carefully constructed composure threatened to unravel, the years of subtle indignities and deliberate dismissals rising like a tide. She felt the familiar burn of anger behind her eyes, a sharp counterpoint to the dull ache of hurt that had settled deep in her bones. She saw the genuine fear in Simone's eyes, a fear that echoed the fear she herself had lived with for so long. Julian, meanwhile, paced like a caged animal, his expensive suit suddenly looking ill-fitting, his carefully crafted persona unraveling thread by thread. His frantic energy only served to amplify the silence, making the unspoken accusations hang heavier in the air. He tried to intervene, to smooth things over, his words clumsy and unconvincing. But his voice, usually commanding, was now thin and reedy, betraying his panic. The power he had so confidently wielded was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Marcus, observing the unfolding drama with a quiet intensity, remained silent, his expression unreadable. But the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flickered between Julian and Ava, spoke volumes. His disappointment wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. The trust he had placed in Julian, a trust built over years of friendship and shared success, was irrevocably broken. The weight of this betrayal, heavier than any financial loss, hung in the air. The once solid foundation of their business partnership was crumbling under the weight of Julian's lies. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed to mock Julian's unraveling. His carefully constructed world, once a beacon of success, was now a sinking ship. The opulent penthouse, a symbol of his power, suddenly felt like a gilded cage. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. Simone's carefully applied makeup couldn't mask the tremor in her hand as she reached for a glass of water, her fingers brushing against the icy chill of the crystal. The penthouse, usually a symbol of Julian's effortless dominance, felt claustrophobic, the panoramic view now a mocking reminder of his crumbling empire. Ava's controlled fury was a tightly wound spring, poised to unleash. She hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, yet her presence filled the room, a silent accusation more potent than any shout. The faint scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, hung in the air, a stark contrast to Simone's overpowering floral scent. The city lights reflected in her eyes, cold and sharp. Julian, a picture of desperate denial, wrung his hands, the expensive fabric of his shirt creasing under the pressure. His usually commanding voice was a pathetic whisper, his carefully cultivated charm replaced by a desperate plea. "Simone, darling, there's been a misunderstanding," he stammered, his words catching in his throat. His gaze darted between Ava and Simone, a frantic animal caught in a snare. Marcus, observing the silent war, felt a cold dread creep into his heart. The icy grip of betrayal tightened around him. The years of friendship, the shared victories, the implicit trust, all were reduced to ashes. He saw the tremor in Ava's jaw, the subtle clenching of her fists. He saw the raw hurt reflected in her eyes, a hurt he understood all too well. He had never seen Ava vulnerable, but now he saw it and it cut him deeply. Simone, finally finding her voice, stammered, I had no idea. I saw the name, the company. I was so focused on the contract, the opportunity." Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of her guilt. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her carefully applied mascara. "I would never have. I'm so sorry." Her apology was genuine, yet somehow inadequate, a meager offering in the face of the damage she'd inflicted. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, the unspoken accusations sharper than any spoken words. The opulent setting became a stark reminder of the deep cracks forming in Julian's carefully crafted world. The city lights outside continued their dazzling display, oblivious to the implosion occurring within the penthouse walls. The battle was far from over, the consequences far-reaching and devastating. The silence hung heavy, thick as the velvet drapes obscuring the city's glittering expanse. Ava's stillness was a storm brewing, the calm before a tempest. The scent of jasmine, her signature perfume, battled with Simone's overly sweet floral fragrance, a silent clash mirroring the war within the penthouse. Julian, usually a master of control, fidgeted, his expensive cufflinks glinting nervously under the harsh overhead light. His carefully constructed composure crumbled, revealing a man consumed by panic. Simone, her carefully applied makeup smudged by unshed tears, reached for a crystal glass, her hand trembling. The ice clinked softly, a fragile sound in the suffocating quiet. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to mend the chasm she'd created. The weight of her deceit pressed down on her, crushing her carefully built ambition. She glanced at Ava, a flicker of fear in her eyes. Ava's controlled fury was palpable, a silent force that radiated from her like heat. Julian, desperate to regain control, interjected, his voice a strained whisper. "It's a misunderstanding, darling. Terrible, awful misunderstanding. She's just overreacting." His gaze flitted between Ava and Simone, betraying his desperation. His usual charisma had evaporated, replaced by a naked plea for understanding. His touch, usually possessive, was now tentative, almost fearful. Ava finally spoke, her voice low and steady, yet laced with an icy chill. Overreacting? Bringing your mistress to a business meeting, humiliating your wife? Is that overreacting, Julian? Each word was a carefully measured blow, each syllable dripping with contempt. Her eyes, usually warm and inviting, were now flint-hard, reflecting the city lights with cold, unforgiving brilliance. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a nearby clock. The opulent surroundings felt suddenly vulgar, a cruel mockery of the betrayal unfolding. Marcus, observing the scene, felt the chill seep into his bones. He saw the damage, the deep wounds hidden beneath Ava's poised exterior. He saw the shattered trust, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. He saw a woman he'd always admired, reduced to silent fury by a man who thought he was above reproach. The repercussions of this betrayal, he knew, would ripple far beyond the confines of this penthouse, shaking the foundations of Julian's carefully crafted empire. The silence stretched, pregnant with unspoken words, with the looming threat of a catastrophic unraveling. The game had changed, the players had shifted, and the consequences were about to be devastating. The opulent penthouse, usually a sanctuary of quiet luxury, felt claustrophobic. The scent of jasmine, sharp and bittersweet, mingled with the metallic tang of fear in the air. Marcus, Julian's business partner, watched, his usually jovial face etched with stunned disbelief. He'd known Julian for years, considered him a friend, and this betrayal felt like a physical blow. Simone, her carefully constructed composure crumbling, stammered, I had no idea. I swear. Her voice, usually confident and crisp, was now a shaky whisper, laced with genuine fear and regret. She glanced at Ava, a mixture of guilt and terror in her eyes. Ava remained silent, her stillness more potent than any outburst. The controlled fury simmering beneath her calm exterior was visible in the rigid set of her jaw, the slight tremor in her perfectly manicured hand. The city lights, reflected in her dark eyes, seemed to intensify the cold fire within her. Julian, his usual arrogance replaced by a desperate plea, reached for Ava's hand. His touch, once confident and possessive, was hesitant, almost pleading. Ava, please. This is a misunderstanding. It means nothing. His voice cracked, revealing the panic that gnawed at him. Marcus cleared his throat, the sound sharp and brittle in the tense silence. His gaze moved from the distraught Simone to the icy calm of Ava, then to the desperate Julian, his face a mask of betrayal and disillusionment. This misunderstanding, he said, his voice low and heavy with accusation, cost me millions. This woman, he gestured towards Simone, was negotiating a vital contract with your wife, Ava, the CEO of Stellar Dynamics, unbeknownst to her and to you, I presume. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The truth, stark and undeniable, shattered the fragile illusion of Julian's carefully constructed world. His carefully crafted image, his wealth, his power, all of it felt suddenly precarious, threatened by the gaping hole of his own deceit. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the city far below. The glittering cityscape, a symbol of Julian's success, now felt like a mocking reminder of his imminent downfall. The game had changed, and Julian was losing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the city lights blinked mockingly outside. Marcus's gaze, hard and unforgiving, lingered on Julian. The scent of expensive scotch, usually a comforting aroma in this penthouse, now felt cloying, acrid. A tremor ran through Julian, a subtle but visible shudder beneath his tailored suit. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His carefully constructed facade, years in the making, was crumbling before his eyes. Ava, her stillness a monument to controlled fury, met Marcus's gaze. There was no triumph in her expression, only a weary understanding. Years of microaggressions, of subtle dismissals, culminated in this moment. The humiliation Julian had intended for her had instead exposed him, stripped him bare. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through her perfectly applied makeup, a stark contrast to the controlled composure she maintained. Simone, her face pale and drawn, shifted nervously. The weight of her deceit pressed down on her, crushing the ambition that had driven her. She'd craved success, power, the trappings of Julian's world, but the cost was far higher than she'd anticipated. Her carefully crafted lies were unraveling, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. I can explain," Simone stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The words caught in her throat, choked by the enormity of her actions. The opulent surroundings, once symbols of allure, now felt like a gilded cage. The weight of the revelation settled heavily upon the room. The carefully manicured image of success, meticulously cultivated by Julian, had shattered. The silence, punctuated only by the soft ticking of a high-end clock, amplified the gravity of the moment, laying bare the chasm that had opened between Julian and the two people he most valued, or at least, pretended to value. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, simmering resentments, and the bitter taste of betrayal. The game had ended, and the consequences would be far-reaching. The beginning of the end had arrived. Simone's confession spilled out in a torrent of remorse, a stark contrast to her earlier calculated composure. The penthouse, usually a symbol of Julian's success, felt suffocating. The scent of expensive scotch now a bitter reminder of his betrayal. Marcus, his face etched with a profound disappointment that went beyond mere business, stared at Julian, the weight of years of friendship crumbling around him. The silence hummed, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in the very bones of the room. He didn't tell me," Simone whispered, her voice choked with tears. I didn't know." She looked at Ava, her eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and fear. The powerful CEO, the woman Simone had tried to manipulate, now held her fate in her hands. Ava didn't speak, her gaze unwavering, locked onto Julian's crumbling facade. The carefully constructed mask of arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, visceral fear. His usually confident posture slumped, his shoulders drooping under the weight of his own deceit. The mahogany table, polished to a gleaming perfection, seemed to amplify the silence, reflecting the fractured image of the man who had once ruled this world with an iron fist. The city lights outside, a glittering tapestry against the night sky, offered no solace. They were witnesses to the unraveling of an empire built on lies and fueled by insecurity. The ticking of the clock, a relentless rhythm in the oppressive silence, marked the slow, agonizing death of Julian's carefully crafted world. His attempt at humiliation had boomeranged, shattering his carefully constructed life, exposing the cracks in his foundation, revealing the hollow core beneath his opulent exterior. A tremor ran through Marcus, a visible shudder in his broad shoulders. He had trusted Julian, believed in his vision, supported him through thick and thin. This betrayal felt like a personal affront, a violation of a sacred bond. The opulent setting, once a symbol of shared triumph, now felt like a tomb, the air thick with the stench of betrayal and broken promises. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, an unspoken accusation that echoed the silent screams of a shattered friendship. The game was over, and the consequences, like the city lights, were far-reaching and inescapable. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner. The scent of expensive scotch, usually a comforting aroma in Julian's opulent penthouse, now hung heavy with the bitter tang of betrayal. Marcus, his usually jovial face etched with a profound disillusionment, ran a hand through his graying hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. He looked from Julian, his face ashen and contorted with a silent scream regarding the pending lawsuit from Ms. Dubois. A wave of nausea washed over him. Simone, the lawsuit, He hadn't even considered the legal ramifications of his actions beyond his marital fallout. He gripped the phone tighter, knuckles bone white. "What is it?" he managed, his voice rough. "Ms. Dubois is pursuing a significant financial settlement," the lawyer continued, his tone devoid of sympathy. "And she's provided substantial evidence of your infidelity. Evidence that, unfortunately, strengthens her case." The phone felt heavy in his hand. He closed his eyes briefly, the image of Ava's face, calm and resolute in court, flashing vividly in his mind. The lawyer's voice faded into the background as the weight of his actions crashed down on him. He hadn't just humiliated his wife. He'd jeopardized his business empire, his reputation, and his financial security. The sandalwood scent of his therapist's office seemed a distant memory. Now, the air in his office tasted acrid, bitter, like defeat. The sunlight seemed to mock him, highlighting the emptiness in his once luxurious surroundings. His once invincible image was crumbling, replaced by a growing awareness of his own culpability. He was alone, his arrogance replaced by a profound and crippling sense of isolation. The silence, once a symbol of his power, was now the deafening roar of his impending ruin. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, falling onto the polished desk with a soft thud. His world, once so meticulously crafted, was collapsing around him, brick by painful brick. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and regret. Julian sat stiffly on the plush couch, the muted tones of the room a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of his life. He'd been coming here for weeks, the sessions a blurred montage of apologies he hadn't fully meant, confessions he'd choked out, and the gnawing emptiness that remained. He'd lost more than money. He'd lost respect, trust, and perhaps, irrevocably, Ava. "The anger is understandable, Julian." Dr. Anya Sharma's voice was calm, a soothing counterpoint to the storm raging inside him. "But dwelling on it won't bring back what's lost." He stared at his hands, gnarled and trembling, a stark testament to his unraveling. I didn't mean to hurt her," he mumbled, the words catching in his throat. The admission felt hollow even to his own ears. His actions screamed louder than any apology. Dr. Sharma nodded gently. "Your actions spoke volumes, Julian. But understanding the why behind those actions is crucial. What fueled your insecurity? Why the need to humiliate Ava?" The question hung heavy in the air, thick with the unspoken. He thought of Ava's unwavering strength, her quiet dignity in the face of his cruelty. He thought of Simone's betrayal, the chilling realization of her ambition, her willingness to exploit his insecurities for her own gain. I was afraid," he finally confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Afraid of being overshadowed. Afraid of her success eclipsing mine." The admission felt like a confession ripped from his soul. He'd built his empire on ambition, on the relentless pursuit of power, but it had all crumbled like a sandcastle in a tidal wave. He closed his eyes, the image of Ava's face, strong and resolute, haunting him. The memory of her quiet dignity in court, the controlled fury simmering beneath the surface, stung him deeply. He hadn't just hurt her. He'd betrayed her trust in a way that might be unforgivable. The lavender scent of the room suddenly felt suffocating. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, each tick a hammer blow against his already shattered self-esteem. He had to rebuild not just his empire, but himself. The road to redemption, he realized, was going to be long and arduous. But it had to start somewhere, somehow. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's trembling hands. He stared at the crisp, legal documents detailing the financial penalties, each line a fresh wound. The opulent office, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a gilded cage. The muted hum of the city outside was a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He'd lost millions, his reputation in tatters, his marriage teetering on the brink of collapse. The taste of ash lingered in his mouth, a bitter reminder of his self-destruction. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture revealing the depth of his stress. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He picked up a framed photo of Ava, her smile radiant, a stark contrast to the grim reality of his current predicament. He'd never seen her so angry, so wounded. The memory of her quiet dignity in court still haunted him, a strength he'd never truly appreciated until it was almost too late. A soft knock broke the silence. His lawyer, Ms. Chan, entered, her expression a mixture of professional sympathy and weary resignation. "The settlement details are finalized, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "You're fortunate Ava agreed to this. Further legal battles would have been detrimental." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Julian nodded, his throat tight. He knew exactly what she meant. Ava could have ruined him completely. The thought sparked a flicker of fear, quickly replaced by a wave of self-loathing. He'd underestimated her, his arrogance blinding him to her true strength. He'd thought to control her, to diminish her, but in doing so, he'd unleashed a power far greater than his own. He hadn't just lost a wife, he'd lost a formidable business partner, an ally. "I understand," he managed, his voice hoarse. The words felt like stones in his throat. He looked out the window, the city lights blurring into a hazy canvas of regret. He had to start somewhere. He had to do better. The thought of facing Ava, of attempting to rebuild any semblance of trust, felt monumental, daunting. But perhaps, just perhaps, the wreckage of his life could be a foundation for something new, something better. The road ahead was long, riddled with uncertainty, but he had to begin the arduous climb toward redemption, toward becoming a man worthy of Ava's forgiveness, a man worthy of himself. The scent of lavender and chamomile hung heavy in the air of Dr. Anya Sharma's office, a deliberate counterpoint to the chaos swirling within Julian. He sat rigidly on the plush sofa, the soft cushions offering no comfort. He'd chosen this therapist based on her reputation for handling high-profile clients, a stark contrast to his usual disdain for anything that smacked of vulnerability. Dr. Sharma, with her calm demeanor and insightful gaze, was already chipping away at his carefully constructed facade. "Your wife, Ava, possesses remarkable strength," Dr. Sharma observed, her voice gentle but firm. The statement felt like an accusation, a mirror reflecting his own failings. Julian shifted uncomfortably. "Strength? She's difficult." The words tasted like ash. He hadn't intended for them to sound so brittle, so defensive. "Difficult? Or different from what you expected?" Dr. Sharma's question hung in the quiet room, each syllable carrying weight. He thought of Ava's quiet dignity in court, the controlled fury that had simmered beneath her composed exterior. He'd mistaken her quiet strength for weakness, her independence for defiance. He closed his eyes, the memory of Simone's horrified face flashing before him. The betrayal hadn't just been towards Ava. It had been towards himself, towards the man he aspired to be, not the man he truly was. A man fueled by insecurity and a crippling need for control. The realization brought a fresh wave of self-loathing. I underestimated her," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. He opened his eyes, meeting Dr. Sharma's steady gaze. He'd used Simone as a weapon, a pathetic attempt to regain a sense of control he'd lost in his marriage. The irony wasn't lost on him. And in doing so, Dr. Sharma continued, her voice soft yet penetrating. "You exposed your own insecurities and vulnerabilities." The words were not a judgment, but an observation, a gentle nudge towards self-awareness. He nodded slowly, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, heavier now than the financial repercussions. The lavender scent suddenly felt cloying, a suffocating reminder of his fragile state. He had a long way to go, a steep climb towards redemption, and the first step, he realized, was admitting his deep-seated flaws. The path ahead was daunting, but the small act of admitting his failures to a stranger felt like a crack of light in the suffocating darkness. The mahogany desk in Ava's office felt strangely cold beneath her fingertips. The cityscape, usually a source of inspiration, now blurred through the rain-streaked window, mirroring the storm raging within her. Weeks had passed since the public implosion of Julian's carefully constructed world, Yet the silence in their home felt heavier than any shouting match. She hadn't spoken to him directly since the divorce papers were served. The legal battles were brutal, the financial settlements complex. Yet strangely, that wasn't the most painful part. A soft knock at the door broke through her reverie. It was Marcus, her business partner, his usually jovial face etched with concern. He carried 2 steaming mugs, the aroma of Earl Grey filling the office. "Coffee wouldn't touch this," he murmured, placing one on her desk. "Heard you were burning the midnight oil again." Ava managed a weak smile. "Some things require more than caffeine, Marcus." He sat down, the leather of his chair creaking softly. "Julian's spiraling," he said, his voice low. "Therapy isn't cutting it. He's losing investors, isolating himself." He paused, stirring his tea thoughtfully. "I feel responsible somehow. I should have seen it coming. The whole Simone thing." Ava looked down at her hands, the polished wood of the desk a stark contrast to the rawness of her emotions. "Don't blame yourself, Marcus. He chose this. He destroyed everything himself." Even as she said it, a flicker of doubt snaked through her. Had she, too, been blind to the cracks in their facade? Had she focused too much on her own success, neglecting the silent screams of her own heart? Marcus reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. "You're stronger than you think, Ava. You're rebuilding an empire, both personally and professionally. That takes courage." His words were balm, yet she felt the sting of her own past vulnerabilities. The years of subtle racism, the quiet humiliations, the constant need to prove herself, all resurfaced with the crushing weight of Julian's betrayal. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. It was the silence of shared experience, of mutual support, of a shared journey toward healing. The rain outside intensified, its rhythm a soundtrack to the slow, deliberate rebuilding of her life. A life free from the suffocating grip of Julian's insecurities and her own past traumas. The city lights twinkled below, a distant yet hopeful glimmer in the storm. The future was uncertain, yet Ava felt a newfound strength, a quiet resolve to navigate the next chapter on her own terms. The scent of Earl Grey lingered, a comforting presence in the aftermath of the storm. The therapy sessions were grueling. Julian, stripped bare of his arrogance, sat hunched in the plush armchair, the scent of expensive leather doing little to mask the odor of his despair. He spoke in clipped, hesitant sentences, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like ancient brickwork under the weight of his own actions. Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm demeanor belied a sharp intellect, listened patiently, her gaze unwavering. I didn't mean to hurt her," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The admission hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to his usual booming pronouncements. He hadn't realized the depth of his own insecurity, the poisonous undercurrent of his need to control, to dominate. Ava's success had become a threat, not a source of pride. The guilt gnawed at him, not just for the humiliation he inflicted, but for the years of subtle slights, the constant undermining of her achievements. He'd mistaken her quiet strength for weakness, her composure for indifference. He saw now, with chilling clarity, the pattern of his own behavior, the insidious racism that had festered unseen within him. Dr. Sharma's gentle probing forced him to confront these truths, to confront the man he had become. He felt a tremor of self-loathing, a cold dread that sunk deeper than any professional setback. The financial ruin, the shattered reputation. These were mere symptoms of a deeper illness, a sickness of the soul. Outside, the city hummed with a life he no longer felt a part of. He felt alone, adrift in a sea of his own making, the silence of the therapy room amplifying the emptiness within. The journey ahead felt long, arduous, and filled with the chilling possibility that he might never truly atone for his actions. He had destroyed something precious, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be rebuilt. Simone sat across from Ava in a small, dimly lit cafe, the aroma of roasted coffee beans battling the lingering scent of her own anxiety. The plush velvet of the armchair felt strangely comforting against her tense shoulders. "Ava," however, remained composed, her gaze steady, unwavering. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware from a nearby table. Finally, Simone spoke, her voice a fragile whisper. I'm so sorry, Ava. I had no idea." Ava met her gaze, her expression unreadable. The years of carefully constructed emotional armor seemed to crack just a fraction. "No idea?" Ava's voice was low, controlled, yet laced with an undercurrent of icy fury. "You used me, manipulated me for your own gain. And you did it while knowing my husband, your lover, was publicly humiliating me." Simone flinched, tears welling in her eyes. "It wasn't like that," she protested, her voice trembling. "I didn't know it was you. I just wanted that contract for my own small design business. The money, it meant everything." She wrung her hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. The meticulously crafted facade, the carefully composed image she projected to the world crumbled, revealing a scared, vulnerable woman. Ava leaned back, her eyes scanning Simone's face, assessing the depth of her remorse. The anger simmered, but a weary sadness replaced the burning rage. "Your ambition blinded you, Simone. It blinded you to the woman I am, to the pain you inflicted." She paused, taking a slow sip of her espresso, the bitter taste mirroring the harsh reality of her situation. Simone's apology continued, a torrent of words tumbling over each other, laced with genuine regret and a desperate plea for forgiveness. She detailed her frantic research after the meeting, the gut-wrenching realization of Ava's identity, the moral conflict that tore at her conscience. She painted a picture of a woman undone by her ambition, a woman who'd traded her integrity for a shot at success. The air in the cafe seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken emotions. Ava listened, her silence more damning than any outburst could have been. The weight of Julian's betrayal, the sting of Simone's manipulation, the years of subtle racism she'd endured, it all pressed down on her. Yet, within that weight, a nascent strength began to stir. This wasn't just about Julian. It was about reclaiming her narrative, her power. The encounter concluded not with forgiveness, but with a silent acknowledgement, an understanding that Simone's punishment wasn't just the loss of the contract but the heavy burden of her own guilt, a burden she would carry long after the cafe lights dimmed. The city hummed outside Ava's penthouse apartment, a low thrum that contrasted sharply with the quiet intensity within. Sunlight, filtered through the sheer curtains, painted dust motes dancing in the air. Ava sat on the balcony, a half-empty glass of wine sweating in her hand. The city spread before her, a glittering tapestry of ambition and indifference, a reflection of her own internal landscape. The taste of the wine was bitter, a metallic tang clinging to her tongue, a bitter echo of the past few weeks. She hadn't contacted Julian. The silence between them was a chasm, vast and unbridgeable. His frantic calls and texts remained unanswered, unread. The thought of his contrition, his pleas, filled her not with satisfaction, but with a weary exhaustion. He'd humiliated her publicly, not just as a wife but as a woman, a black woman navigating a world still rife with prejudice. A soft knock on the balcony door startled her. It was her sister, Chioma, a vibrant force of nature whose laughter could fill a room. Chioma entered, carrying a steaming mug and a plate laden with pastries. The aroma of cinnamon and warm sugar filled the air, a comforting counterpoint to the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. "You haven't eaten anything all day?" Chioma said, her voice gentle but firm, placing the mug in Ava's hand. "I brought you something to help you." Ava managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Chioma." She took a sip of the hot chocolate, the sweetness momentarily soothing the raw edges of her pain. "It's just hard to believe this is my life right now." Chioma sat beside her, her hand resting comfortingly on Ava's arm. "You're stronger than you think, Ava. You've always been. This is just a bump in the road." Her voice held a note of unwavering support, a quiet strength that mirrored Ava's own burgeoning resilience. The conversation flowed, easing the weight on Ava's shoulders. Chioma talked about her work, her children, injecting life and laughter back into Ava's world. Slowly, a flicker of hope ignited within Ava's chest, a tiny spark against the darkness. The city lights twinkled below, no longer a symbol of indifference, but a promise of a brighter tomorrow, one she would build herself. The journey would be long, the road arduous, but for the first time in weeks, Ava felt the tentative stirrings of healing. The scent of lilies, Ava's favorite, hung heavy in the air of her therapist's office, a stark contrast to the sterile clinical feel. Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose calm presence was as soothing as the aromatherapy diffusers, offered a gentle smile. "How are you feeling today, Ava?" Ava hesitated, the city's relentless energy echoing in the quiet room. "Tired," she finally admitted, her voice a low murmur. "Exhausted, like I'm still wading through quicksand." Dr. Sharma nodded, her gaze understanding. The aftermath of such a significant betrayal. It's not surprising. But you're here. You're actively working through it. Ava traced the rim of her coffee cup, the warmth a small comfort against the lingering chill of Julian's betrayal. It's not just the infidelity, you know. It was the public humiliation. The way he used our marriage, my success, as a weapon. The bitterness edged her voice. The memory of Simone's shocked face. The whispers in the boardroom. The cold weight of isolation. It all clawed at her. "And how does that make you feel?" Dr. Sharma prompted gently. "Vulnerable," Ava breathed, her eyes glistening. "Exposed. Like everything I'd built, everything I am, was suddenly fragile." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "It's made me question everything. My choices, my judgment, even my own self-worth." Dr. Sharma leaned forward, her expression empathetic. "It's understandable to feel that way after such a profound violation of trust. But your strength, your resilience in navigating this, that's undeniable. You're rebuilding. You're here." A small, almost imperceptible, smile touched Ava's lips. "I am." The thought resonated, a fragile seed of hope pushing through the hardened soil of her pain. The city outside might roar with ambition and indifference, but within her, a quieter, stronger current was beginning to flow, the current of self-discovery, of healing, of a future built on her own terms, independent of Julian's shadow. The taste of bitterness lingered, but it was no longer overwhelming. A new flavor was emerging, the subtle sweetness of resilience. The mahogany desk in Ava's new office felt solid, grounding, a stark contrast to the precariousness of the last few months. Sunlight streamed through the expansive window, illuminating the cityscape sprawling below. It was a view Julian had always coveted, a symbol of her success he'd secretly resented. Now it was hers alone. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, rich and dark, filled the air, a comforting aroma against the lingering bitterness. She picked up a photograph, a smiling Ava, younger, more carefree, beside a grinning Julian. The memory stung, a sharp jab of regret. Had she been blind? Had she ignored the subtle ways he'd chipped away at her confidence, masked his insecurities with cruel displays of dominance? Her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. He'd called several times over the past few weeks, offering support, professional advice, a friendship that felt unexpectedly solid. "Ava," his voice was warm, a comforting balm. "I just wanted to see how things were going. The new partnership with Zenith is progressing well, thanks in part to your unique approach to negotiations." His chuckle was laced with relief and a hint of something else, admiration. Perhaps? Ava smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile that hadn't visited her face in months. "It's going well, Marcus. Better than I could have hoped, actually. Thank you for your support. It meant a lot." The silence stretched, comfortable and understanding. "Listen," Marcus said finally, his voice softer now. "About Julian, I know this isn't easy, but you're stronger than you think. You're thriving." He never understood that. A wave of gratitude washed over her. This wasn't just about Julian's downfall. It was about her own rise. The quiet strength in Marcus's voice resonated. a reminder of the unwavering support she'd found in unexpected places. The city below pulsed with energy, a vibrant testament to her resilience, to her future, unburdened by Julian's shadow. The bitterness remained, a lingering ache, but it was fading, replaced by something stronger, the quiet, unwavering certainty of her own power. The future was unwritten, yet it held a promise, a potent blend of hope and hard-earned wisdom. The scent of jasmine hung heavy in the air as Ava walked through her childhood neighborhood. Brick houses, once familiar, now felt distant, their faded paint mirroring the faded memories of a life she'd left behind. A child's laughter echoed, a sharp contrast to the quiet ache in her chest. This walk, a ritual she'd started weeks ago, wasn't just about exercise. It was about reclaiming a part of herself lost in the whirlwind of Julian's betrayal. She paused before her old family home, the porch swing creaking gently in the breeze. The chipped paint, the slightly crooked gate, all whispered stories of a simpler time, before ambition and betrayal had shattered her world. She saw a reflection of her younger self in the window, vulnerable, hopeful, unaware of the pain that lay ahead. Her phone vibrated. It was her sister, Zara. "Ava, heard you're doing great. Mama wants to see you. Dinner Saturday." Zara's voice, warm and familiar, pierced through the melancholy. A hesitant smile touched Ava's lips. Dinner with her mother, a woman who'd always believed in her, despite Julian's constant attempts to undermine her. It felt like a step towards healing, a reconnection with a love that had remained unshaken. "Saturday's good," Ava replied, her voice still tinged with the lingering bitterness, but with a hint of newfound strength. "I'll be there." The next day brought a meeting with a potential investor, a woman named Isabella Rossi. Isabella, shrewd and perceptive, listened intently as Ava outlined her new business venture, a tech startup focused on sustainable energy solutions. Ava's passion, once dimmed by Julian's actions, burned brighter than ever, fueling her words, her energy, her very being. She saw the flicker of admiration in Isabella's eyes, a reflection of the power she'd rediscovered. The deal, almost finalized, felt like a victory, not just for her business, but for herself. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, Ava looked out at the city lights. The view was stunning, yet the memories of Julian still lingered, a ghost haunting her success. She felt a wave of exhaustion, a profound sense of emptiness. The anger had subsided, replaced by a quieter sorrow. But beneath it, a quiet strength was growing, a resolute determination to build a life defined by her own terms, unburdened by the weight of the past. The future, once shrouded in uncertainty, now shimmered with the promise of a new dawn. Her journey was far from over, but tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, the beginning of a long, hard-earned peace. The courtroom was frigid, a stark contrast to the simmering rage that pulsed beneath Ava's composed exterior. Julian, his face gaunt and pale, sat hunched over, the expensive suit doing little to disguise his defeat. The judge's gavel, a symbol of finality, echoed in the hushed silence. The financial penalties were staggering, a brutal reflection of his hubris and betrayal. He'd lost more than just money. He'd lost respect, his standing in the community, and most importantly, Ava. The divorce was finalized. The papers, crisp and unforgiving, lay on the mahogany table, a testament to the irreversible damage he'd caused. "All assets will be divided as per the prenuptial agreement," the judge stated, his voice echoing the weight of the situation. Ava felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. The victory tasted like ash. Outside the courtroom, the city's cacophony offered no solace. The relentless rhythm of traffic only amplified the silence within her. The crisp autumn air, usually invigorating, felt heavy, laden with the residue of betrayal and disappointment. Later, over a quiet dinner with Zara, the familiar warmth of her sister's presence offered a balm to her wounds. Zara's hand, warm and comforting, rested over Ava's. "It's over, Ava," Zara whispered, her voice laced with empathy. "You're free." Ava nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Free," she repeated, the word feeling both liberating and strangely terrifying. The future stretched before her, vast and uncertain, yet brimming with the potential for a life finally lived on her own terms. The taste of independence was bittersweet, tinged with the lingering ghost of pain, but undeniable. Days turned into weeks, then months. Ava threw herself into her work, the demanding schedule a welcome distraction. Isabella Rossi's investment had proven a turning point. The sustainable energy venture thrived, exceeding all expectations. Ava's leadership, once shadowed by Julian's presence, shone brightly, drawing accolades and respect. Her success was a quiet rebellion, a powerful affirmation of her worth independent of any man's validation. One evening, she found herself standing on her balcony, the city sprawling beneath her. The lights twinkled like distant stars, mirroring the hope that now flickered within her. A text message chimed. It was from Julian, a simple, "I'm sorry." Ava stared at the message, her heart heavy. The apology, though heartfelt, couldn't erase the pain. It couldn't undo the years of subtle indignities, the blatant humiliation. She deleted the message, a silent act of closure. The city lights pulsed, a silent testament to her resilience, her strength, her newfound freedom. The future was hers to shape, a future unburdened by the weight of a past she was finally leaving behind. The jasmine scent of her childhood neighborhood, a lingering memory of pain, was slowly being replaced by the fresh, invigorating scent of possibility. The crisp morning air bit at Ava's cheeks as she stepped out of her sleek, black SUV. The imposing architecture of the law firm loomed, a monument to Julian's now-shattered empire. Inside, the hushed reverence felt suffocating. She signed the final papers, the ink a stark black against the pristine white. The legal battle was over, but the emotional wreckage remained. The weight of it settled heavily on her chest, a physical manifestation of the years spent suffocating under Julian's control. Later, at Zara's apartment, the scent of cinnamon and warmth enveloped her. Zara, ever practical, had prepared a comforting meal. "He's filing for bankruptcy," Zara announced, her voice low. Ava barely registered the news. The enormity of what she'd endured seemed to eclipse everything else. "It doesn't matter," Ava murmured, staring into the steaming mug of tea. "It's over." Zara's hand covered Ava's. "It's over," she repeated, her voice filled with a quiet understanding that transcended words. "But you're still here. You're stronger than you know." That evening, Ava sat on her balcony, the city lights a glittering tapestry below. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the hum of her own strength, a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. Her phone buzzed. It was Simone. A simple, "I'm truly sorry," was all it said. Ava paused, the words surprisingly devoid of the bitterness she expected. There was regret, and perhaps a flicker of hope for Simone's redemption. Ava didn't reply. Forgiveness was a process, not a single act. The future, once a blurry canvas of fear and uncertainty, was now taking shape, painted with strokes of self-discovery and resilience. The scent of jasmine, once a constant reminder of her past, was fading, replaced by the invigorating scent of freedom and the subtle, promising aroma of a new beginning. The city lights below pulsed with a life of their own, mirroring the vibrant pulse of hope that now beat within her. The mahogany of Julian's once impressive desk now felt cheap, its polish dulled by the grime of his downfall. He sat hunched over, the expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, a stark contrast to the powerful figure he once projected. The legal papers, crisp and unforgiving, lay scattered before him, each a testament to his failures. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and regret. A soft knock echoed in the cavernous office. His lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man whose face usually held an air of detached professionalism, entered with a weariness that mirrored Julian's own despair. "The divorce is finalized," Davies stated, his voice devoid of any unnecessary sentiment. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Julian's response was a hollow chuckle, devoid of humor. So it's officially over. Everything. He gestured around the opulent yet now hollow office, a space that once symbolized his success, now a mausoleum to his shattered ambitions. Davies leaned against the desk, his gaze sympathetic yet firm. Ava, she's doing remarkably well. She secured a major contract last week. The news, intended as a neutral observation, felt like a sharp jab to Julian's already wounded pride. He had underestimated her, dismissed her strength, believing his wealth and social standing gave him power over her.